All right, Luke Thomas, the host of the MMA Hour. I'm delighted to say he joins us on the line. Luke, good morning to you. How are things?
Good. I'm doing well, and thank you guys for inviting me. I appreciate it.
No, it's great to have you on. So we've got to talk about this fight this weekend. It is fight week. I'm sure the hype over there is building and building at the moment. We've seen varying degrees of Conor McGregor, let's put it that way, over the last couple of weeks, from press conferences to an interview he's done with the Mac Life over the last 24, 48 hours. From your view, what is the real mindset that Conor McGregor is experiencing at the moment?
Like you guys, I'm on the outside looking in. I'll just say this. A lot of people make a lot of press conferences, and I think that made sense, certainly in the Jose Aldo fight where they had this, or even the Mayweather fight where they had this constant exposure to one another. There was a question of like what it all will mean ultimately come fight night. What is this proxy battle that's playing out? But they had one press conference. Khabib's a hard guy to rattle, so I don't make it much of it on his end. He had a subsequent interview that also came out, I think, last night with ESPN. He looked and sounded fine. I know some folks who were there in camp, they all said he looked great. In the case of McGregor, yeah, was he dialing it up to 10 or 11 at the presser? Of course he was. But there was no audience there. There was the one press conference. He had a show to put on. So, is he unhinged? Is he rattled? Maybe. But it could also be that there's nothing really to it. And that interview you saw on the Mac Life, he looked like he was dialed in to me. So I'm expecting a battle, and I'm expecting the guy to win, to be just a more talented athlete, not the one who was emotionally rattled necessarily.
Yeah, I think we can read in a little bit too much into the competitive advantages of these press conferences, just because quite often they're so bloody box office, especially when it comes to Conor McGregor, and it's just headline news for days and days and days. But just looking again at that Mac Life interview, the things he says, like, I'm not in this for the money. We've seen him say that before, but he seems much more of a career-focused guy. He's almost mapping out his next few fights in that interview on Sunday. Quite a serious tone, and the fighter Conor McGregor, rather than the businessman Conor McGregor, has come back into sharp focus.
Yeah, that's right. But it's also an older Conor McGregor. He has a child, right? And he has some of this established business, and he made an absolute killing. Good for him in that Mayweather fight. And so I think when you're financially stable and your family is stable and your career is, certainly we don't know exactly what his next move is, but his place in the firmament of greats is certainly there. You begin to just say, okay, why am I doing this? What matters to me? You can really refocus and you can distill the ultimate purpose. And I think you saw that. I think he says he's not in it for the money. It's like, I don't think it's exactly what he meant. I think what he meant to say was, certainly he's not going to compete for anything but a top dollar. But, has he already made enough money to retire? He has. So it's not necessarily that he's looking to achieve some financial threshold. He's looking to, I think, answer a competitive threshold. And I actually believe him when he says that.
Yeah, he corrects himself pretty quickly when he said he wasn't in for the money this time. One thing I did mention was talking about not getting a chance to defend his 145 belt. Do you think that's something that was ever realistically on the table? And do you ever expect him to compete at 145 again?
I don't. I mean, at the same time he was offering to compete at 145, he was talking in that same interview about just how murderous the weight cuts were and how important it is to not have just a 165-pound division, but a lot of extra divisions. And whether or not it's a good idea, we can debate. I do think the 165 is a good idea. Beyond that, it's a little dicier, but certainly point well taken, right? He was looking out for athlete health, not merely his own, but the rest of his contemporaries and the future fighters to come. Could he make 145 if it was the really right opportunity? I bet he could. He's never missed weight. He's always showed up on time, press conferences notwithstanding. But you get the idea. He's a professional. Like when he says he can make it, I believe him. But I would say that door, if not closed, is pretty much closed. He'll do it, but only if it's the truly best circumstance.
Yeah, and even the fact that he's talking about 165 and discussing that potential division, obviously we've had a lot of talk about that in the last week. How important is it that he's kind of put his weight behind that a little bit and said that maybe one of his legacies in the sport could be broadening out and introducing these new weight divisions?
So in as much as what he said, it was intriguing, in as much as what he said, it was not necessarily important. And here's what I mean. Unless he really and demonstrably put his weight behind it, the UFC is not going to answer to it. In other words, they don't want to do this 165-pound division right now for Nate Diaz and Dustin Poirier because they don't want to be leveraged, and they especially don't want to be leveraged by a Diaz brother on late notice, even if that's the best idea. So while Conor put his weight behind it, I think that's important. But unless he really gets out there and says, I'm not fighting again until you make this division, this is important, you want me back, these are the terms, then and only then do I think that would really push the ball forward. So I appreciate his advocacy of it, and I don't think it's nothing, but it's not really enough to make a demonstrable change if this is all it's going to be.
Right, okay. That's going to become a very interesting storyline, I'd imagine, over the next couple of weeks and months beyond this fight. But just kind of one final point I took from that interview, and I'm sure you took from it as well, because both of us working in the media, I think when he talks about the media commitments, he compares it to the murderous weight cuts. They're the two worst things, he says, the media commitments and the weight cuts. Now, we're not playing the poor boy here. We don't care if somebody hates the media. They're like well entitled to say that they despise doing media commitments. We're not trying to make people feel sorry for us whatsoever. But it is interesting that Conor McGregor is saying this. It is interesting that the guy who he lauded as the person who's able to get inside the mind of his opponents time and time again, and with particular notoriety against Jose Aldo, a lot of people perhaps give that a lot of competitive glorification, that he would actually say that this grinds him down, or I certainly took that from this, that his whole process of thinking about the mind of his opponent is something that wears him down a little bit as well in fight week. Am I reading into that comment a little bit too much, Luke?
I don't think so. I mean, the contours of it can be a little bit hard to decipher, but the general commitments that go with it, where he's talking about journalist A says, "Did you see what so-and-so said on Twitter?" He had, he seemed obviously fatigued with that kind of thing. I can tell you, I've been taking that to heart. He's not the only one. Remember St. Pierre at the end of his run there, he was getting snappy with the media. He snapped at me once. I've interviewed him probably a dozen times. That was the only time it was contentious. And he had talked about being burnt out with it. Ronda Rousey had done the same thing. She didn't even want to talk to the media at all. A lot of these like truly upper tier stars, they talk about that media burden as being totally overwhelming. Somehow Mayweather has made it work. I've covered a lot of his fights. He seems to not be too bothered by it. I don't know what his method is, but I absolutely take McGregor at his word. That is just way, way too much. I was glad. There probably could have been a little bit more promotion for this, but in the end, maybe a little bit less can be a little bit more. And, whether it's a certain kind of question or a certain kind of interview that makes them a little bit more angry than the other, I don't know. But clearly the weight of it all is a little bit too much to bear, especially if you can do it in one go or a second go. But over time, when you're consistently popular, man, that's hard to do.
And with that all said about the media commitments, we've touched on it kind of briefly, but there is this idea, there's kind of the aura of McGregor, and the idea that, say, particularly Aldo and Alvarez maybe froze on the big night and kind of got caught by deers in the headlights. And, we don't know if that's because of McGregor's movements when he's in there, or if it is the idea that he's got inside their heads. Do you think it has any impacts on these fights? And do you think we're going to see kind of a further amping up of this kind of WWE sort of like crazy atmosphere on Thursday night?
Well, do I think it's had an impact? Going into the Aldo fight, here's the thing. I just don't like it when we have these conversations, not you and I per se, but in the media generally. Whenever McGregor fights, like there's never any attention, or very little anyway, paid to like how good of a fighter he is. It's always like, is he in his head? How much is in his head? What kind of mind games? I'm not here to dismiss it. I think in the Aldo fight, it probably did play a role, and I tried to downplay it at the time to my own detriment. But over time, generally, I just think it has some effect. Sometimes it's very hard to predict. It's not linear. I mean, look at all of the stuff they did with Mayweather. Look at all the nasty things McGregor said about him, not being able to read and God knows what else. And it had zero effect on him, none. Like it didn't matter at all. So, yes, Mayweather's a seasoned pro and very different than the rest, but Khabib has had very little exposure to McGregor. They had the one press conference, they'll have another, and that's basically it. For the first one, there wasn't even an audience, right? So it's just too hard to predict. For me, after the fight, if we can tell if something was off, then we bring it up. But I'm going to focus on Khabib's skills and his threats, and I'm going to focus on Conor's skills and his threats too.
Yeah, for sure. Like you have spoken on the show, maybe not about the impact of what is said, but about the context of what is said and the content of what was said, and sort of the geopolitical ramifications of what has been said, particularly in that first press conference. But just kind of separate from that and what you've done and the people you've interviewed, what sort of atmosphere do you think is going to prevail in Vegas on Saturday night? It's all going to be fine, right?
It'll be great. It'll be great, I'm sure. I mean, I think that the UFC is ready for this moment. I think fans are ready for this moment. I've only covered one other McGregor fight in person. That was 205. Alvarez won in New York City. I can tell you, boy, the Irish, they are, there's something different. They showed up, and after he won, in a glorious way, of course, everyone remembers, they spilled out onto 7th Avenue in front of Madison Square Garden, which is this major thoroughfare. And they were chanting in the streets all in unison to the point where traffic, you could see it, was backed up all the way to Times Square. And the cops, kind of eventually, gently pushed them back to the sidewalk. But I think it'll be like that. I think it's going to be noisy. It's going to be ruckus, but I think it'll be safe. And I think in the end, it's going to be a great night to remember. Who's going to win? Your guess is as good as mine. But I actually think it's going to. I think MMA has been waiting for Conor McGregor. I think Conor McGregor is happy to be back, and I think it's all going to work out in the end.
And as somebody who follows the sport and, or more importantly, covers it, how happy are you to have McGregor back? How excited are you to have this fight happening this week?
Yeah, I mean, I'm beyond excited. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why, right? Like, let's be real about it. You guys know this. When McGregor's back, it's good for our business, right? It's very good for our business. So I'm not going to sit here and say that's not true, because it's incontestably true. So that part is good. The second part, though, is, man, look, we're talking about the sweet spot of MMA. You're asking which divisions are best in MMA in any organization virtually, including regional shows, international shows. It's usually that 155, 170-pound division. You can find murderers all across the world right located there. So here we are, two of the best guys to ever have done it in this division facing off. I know if you watch the UFC promos, they're making it about the bus incident. I don't really care about the bus incident anymore. I care about the fact that one guy was gone for a while, and there's this other guy that's been doing well in his place. And by the way, folks are forgetting this. People, I mean, I know St. Pierre did it, but that's St. Pierre. People just generally don't take 2 years off of MMA and come back and win. Mayweather did it a lot in boxing, but boxing's very different. He was a lot more seasoned at the time. This is a major risk and, frankly, a major experiment that I'm looking to see how it goes. So to ask me if I'm excited to see McGregor back, yeah, a lot.
The predictions seem to be split a little bit going into this. Khabib says he will be fighting a little bit angry as a result of what's been said. Do you think that gives him an advantage or not? And I'm not sure if you're going to give us a prediction. It sounds like you're not going to quite stick your neck out and tell us who's going to win.
Yeah, I mean, look, predictions are something that most experts actually shouldn't do. I read a book on expertise, and really what experts should do is you should try to have a sense about the future, but it's really evaluating the past and how things happened. I mean, here's what I would say about it. I think for me, to make a personal prediction, like here's who's going to win, there's just too many unknowns. I just mentioned the 2 years off. What impact is that going to have? If it has no impact, that will be absolutely mind-blowing. But it's entirely conceivable, right? On the other hand, I mean, would it really shock you if Khabib went in there and just ran him over for 5 rounds? He does that to everybody. Why would McGregor be the exception? That would be a totally plausible scenario. Here's what I would say. I honestly don't know, and I know that is totally unsatisfying as a response. The only piece of thing I'll give to hang on to is that, historically speaking, matchups like this, if you just look at them in the way in which they have typically gone, it would tend to favor Khabib. But I say that very cautiously, and I say that with a ton of unknowns out there. So if I had to lean a direction, it's that way. But I am not putting money down. Trust me.
Yeah, I don't think either of us will be. But that whole divergence of opinions and, I guess, divergence of possible outcomes is what makes this such a salivating fight on Saturday night. Before we let you go, Luke, we did want to talk about something else, because we do cover doping quite a bit on Off the Ball here on the show. And yeah, I guess on your own show on the MMA Hour recently, I think it was the 30th anniversary of the dirtiest race in history of Seoul 1988. You went on like a really sensible sort of monologue about why MMA fans and why sports fans in general, I actually feel it was kind of a really good monologue that sports fans should watch, about why we can't get carried away with this whole propaganda that we live in the post-doping era in any sport. It's a term that's trundled out quite a bit when it comes to cycling at the moment, and particularly when it comes to combat sports, where the ramifications of doping can be quite severe, far more severe than any sort of racing sport. We need to be very cautious with how we talk about a sport that perhaps is entering a post-doping era. So I guess we'll ask you that. Has there been a doping era in MMA? Is there a post-doping era? Or is anybody who says that such an era exists, are they well in over their head?
I'm willing to believe that the doping era we're in now is demonstrably different than the doping era we were in before. But I wouldn't call it post-doping. I mean, the major thing that I had anticipated when USADA would come is that, yes, some people would get off early. Some people would, they would never used, would just carry on as normal. But what it would really do is it would make fighters better at cheating. Because you would have to be in order to take it. And I know that sounds a bit defeatist, perhaps, but the reality is that if you look at worldwide doping, you guys know this since you've covered it, and you've had some great guests on who would disagree with me quite vehemently, and I certainly respect that, but you have 1% adverse analytical findings to international testing, and then you have private surveys of athletes, and they're responding to 40-50% rates in terms of use. The math just doesn't really hold up. Now those guys have much more experience at the international level with stricter testing. But the point I made and the monologue you had talked about was that in 1968, when they were trying to find amphetamines in racing, it was a reasonably doable thing. It's just not doable anymore. There are so many different kinds of drugs. most of them designer. Most of these are discovered through investigations, not through testing. And so the reality is they're just going to keep using. And the two possibilities you face are, one, you could have these incredibly harsh punishments, but I actually think you would damage your sport potentially irreparably if you do that. I mean, the idea is that it's supposed to be deterrence, but there is no real deterrence that I can detect. What I can detect is just smarter evasion. And as a consequence, when someone does get hemmed up, it's going to have massive implications for your sport to simply function. And the other way you can go is you could say, well, look, I don't know what the answer is. And I'm telling your audience, I do not know what the answer is. There's a great Scottish academic by the name of Paul DeMeo who has done a fantastic work, has a new book on that. He's trying to find a new way forward because you can't simply have free reign. But this idea of zero tolerance, of hammering it down, of we're going to deter through force, I just don't think it works. I think finding some kind of way to live with it is probably a little bit better. And that's where the debate needs to shift.
And just considering that we are, 3 years into USADA having this deal with the UFC, overall, do you think it's had a positive or negative impact? And are there kind of negatives, say, on the weight cutting side, banning of IVs that have maybe made the sport even more dangerous?
It's a tougher question. People have asked me that all the time. Is MMA better off because of USADA? Certainly if you are a big believer in the modern anti-doping movement and its institutions, you might argue yes. I would argue, to your point, that the methods of adjustment have not gone quite easily. Weigh-ins are a little more problematic than they used to be. That is not USADA's fault entirely. I mean, there's a lot of fault that goes on the fighters or the culture in terms of preserving these barbaric weight cutting practices. So I don't want to be unfair to them in that regard. But their banning of the IVs certainly has not helped, even if they believe there's a important reason for that. But then you go back to the UFC. Why aren't they creating more divisions? To what McGregor said, you get the whole idea. I would say, look, probably some stricter doping controls has probably helped. On the other hand, it's probably only exacerbated what we already know to be true, which is that richer athletes can afford more designer things and have better representation legally and better ability to avoid punishment or detection altogether. So I would say it's probably split in a net way. I would probably lean towards negative, not all good, not all bad. But again, if you're asking me, is this the optimal way to do things? I have a hard time believing this is the optimal way to do things in light of the fact that they just changed their policy towards, UFC did, announcing these test failures when 1/3 of them have been reversed because of contaminated supplements.
Yeah, well, I think it's fair to say that maybe it's a step in the right direction, but to say that it's going to solve all problems is simply a laughable notion, because we all know that testing does not work. And USADA, there may not be any malice in the idea, but still their tests just simply do not work. You can say that for every single sport out there, and you've mentioned yourself there with the statistics. You mentioned there the amount of money that UFC fighters earn, or if you got more money, you're able to protect yourself a little bit more. What I would wonder is, in terms of athlete welfare within UFC and perhaps within other MMA promotions, the idea of whistleblowers, because if you think about the most famous whistleblower in modern doping, it is Floyd Landis. And to a certain extent, would Floyd Landis have come out if Lance Armstrong had been a little kinder to him, if he was a little bit richer, if he had nothing really to gain from not the notoriety, but from the sort of feeling of duty that was in his head at the time when he came out with those explosive revelations about US Postal? If you're not looking after your fighters too well, which the UFC has sometimes been levelled with that accusation, well, the potential for whistleblowers to come out is surely a bigger possibility, and something that, if there is widespread doping going on in the sport, is quite a worrying possibility for Dana White.
Yeah, except here's the difference. In MMA, there is this weird culture of omerta, and it's bizarre. And you saw it with Jon Jones, and I don't know if I was surprised. I guess I was surprised. Yeah, I guess I was surprised, at least to the level which we saw it, where they're like, well, I'm upset that there was this uneven punishment for a multiple-time offender. Okay, in theory, I can get that. But then when you looked at what the reasoning was, and this was, remember, the report in the arbitration was written by McLaren himself, the guy in charge of the report that Russia was supposed to acknowledge before they could even be let back into the community of nations. And people are saying that's not good enough. But the point being is, when it came out that he was like, well, I don't know how much fault there is, and this guy gave up information relative to USADA investigations, everyone was calling him a snitch. You even had Verdum. Verdum apparently has this relationship with Ramzan Kadyrov, and he's like, but I don't want to be a snitch. It's like, it's just this weird moral compass, where I think guys see it, and in MMA they hate it, or they have mixed feelings about it, whatever. They know it's not right. for whatever that means. But a lot of people don't want to say anything because apparently telling other people about that wrongdoing is considered disreputable. But I tried to explain to people, like, how do people get caught in anti-doping? Typically the big ones anyway. Yes, you catch the random idiots through testing, but the generally big fish, it comes through investigations. That's a critical component to their anti-doping efforts. And you want to, like, if you really care about anti-doping, USADA took off 2.5 years. Boy, they must really love the information they gave. It must be really valuable. I found that shocking. So you're asking, like, would there be whistleblowers given all the different motivations for them to be, whether it's poverty or some other kind of issue? Ordinarily, I'd say yes, but inside this culture, there's a bit of a backwards thinking on it.
The omerta sounds familiar.
That's it. And just finally, on that Jon Jones case and like the idea that he's given over this information, do you expect that to be substantive information, anything to come from that?
Your guess is as good as mine. Folks have said that whatever value came from that would have already materialized. Because otherwise, how could you reduce the punishment if it didn't prove itself to be valuable, rather than something you could use down the line? I don't have any thoughts about it. I don't blame Jon for doing it. It was in the rules. It's self-preservation. I found the rules to be draconian to begin with. And if USADA found it that valuable, then I'm not sure why fans are supposed to be upset about it. And by the way, you're asking if it's good if Conor McGregor is back. I realize this will be a contentious opinion, and I understand that, and I understand folks will not agree. I'm happy to see Jon Jones back as well.
Right, okay. So that's an interesting discussion. I think we should continue this discussion at some other point. Like the only final point, because we're kind of out of time, Luke, that I wanted to ask you about is, I guess, this idea that maybe the bringing in of USADA helps on some sort of optical level, that, it looks like the UFC aligning with USADA is a good thing. And you look at someone like Jeff Nowitzki, obviously brought in over the past couple of years as well. From your view, has that been a positive step overall for the UFC? There might have been parts of optics for that, and I get that, but has there been an actual momentum change as a result of his implementation and his introduction to the UFC fold?
And sorry, Luke, if I could just tag on to that really briefly, is the fact that USADA came in very close to the time when the UFC was ultimately sold on, is that kind of a coincidence, or was that part of a kind of legitimizing and packaging the sport before it was sold on?
Yeah, the sale, I'm not sure I know about. People have theorized about that. I've had some talks with some folks. I can't say it's not true. I don't have enough evidence to say that it is. Here's what I can say. Let's start with Nowitzki first. Certainly, he and I don't really agree about anti-doping. So in that sense, we just have divergent worldviews. But I certainly trust that he's a guy who does his job in earnest and good faith. I will say, remember, his job is athlete health and well-being generally. Sure. So I think he is trying to make some inroads into some other issues, in particular weight cutting, to make things easier on athletes. Whether or not he's got all the right ideas, I don't know. But I certainly believe that he's a valuable contributor, at least in that regard. But as it relates to why they're with USADA, this is to me very simple. And it's actually the one argument I find very compelling, which is I don't really think that they care about cleaning up the sport. And frankly, I don't think the fans do either. I just don't buy that at all. What I buy is that in the event of disaster, God forbid, that a fighter is severely injured, let's say paralysis or death, and the fighter who is competing against him tests positive for some kind of PEDs, they can have what I call social insurance, where at that point they can say, look, this is terrible. We will do everything we can to make sure this never happens again. But look at what we did. We had the highest level of drug testing. Even if that doesn't necessarily mean what it's supposed to mean among critical observation, I think to the wider public that would be very valuable. And now here's the problem. You caught the tiger by the tail. The dog has been chasing the car, but it finally got it. Now what do you do with it? How do you back out from that position now that you've arrived there? I don't know how you do that. So I can agree that's pretty compelling logic, but I think that's really the only one motivating all of this.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that. Like you mentioned 1968 and cycling a few moments ago, like 1967 obviously lives in infamy in the cycling world with the death of Tom Simpson, but hopefully MMA will never come to that sort of grim reality itself. Luke, it's been fascinating chatting to you. That's one hell of a discussion there. Hopefully we'll be able to continue it again, maybe on the opposite end of this fight, because it is a huge fight week in Las Vegas. Enjoy it on Saturday night, and hopefully it will be a good one.
Happy to come back on anytime, guys. Thank you so much.
Nice one. Appreciate it, Luke. Luke Thomas there, host of the MMA Hour.